In the wake of the recent conflict between Hamas and Israel, there has been an outpouring of sentiment from every perspective imaginable, and one such perspective was, unsurprisingly, one of the most intense partisans on the issue, conservative pundit and media magnate Ben Shapiro. Ben took this conflict as an opportunity to voice his love for his Jewish heritage, publishing a video entitled, "I Am a Jew," and like most ethnic manifestos, it is chock full of extravagant rhetoric, emotionally compelling sentiment, and of course, some very telling lines of reasoning. For most of my life, I genuinely didn't see why so many people talk so much in so many different eras about Jews and Jewishness in history. I didn't understand what people saw in the issue. It seemed foreign, strange, and even laughable. I would often be irritated with leftists claiming that anti-Semitism was alive and well, thinking that this was just another case of cherry-picking fringe notions. And I do think anti-Semitism is a fringe notion still, but in studying the Levant, I have become more aware of American language and perceptions around the issue of Israel. As with any topic, the closer you get, the more details you see, and the less absolute your vision becomes, and this was certainly the case with me on this issue. One key aspect of this issue, however, which I have grown to realize, is the significance of Jewish identity and how it is used by many advocates for Israel. And although you can catch whispers and insinuations from many American Jews, and usually frankness from their more forthright Israeli counterparts, I've never seen this relationship spoken about quite so compellingly as by Ben Shapiro here, so let's take a listen.
Those have been the words of the Jewish people for 3 millennia. Those were the words of the men, women, and children of Masada. Those were the words of the followers of Bar Kokhba. Those were the words of Jews in Granada in 1066 and the Rhineland in 1096, and Khmelnytsky from 1648 to 1657, and Kishinev in 1903, and Hebron in 1929. Those were the words of Jews in Auschwitz and Treblinka. Those were the last words of Daniel Pearl. And those are my words too. They're the words of my parents, the words of my wife, my children. Over the weekend, my people, the Jewish people, were attacked. They're murdered, mutilated. Our women were raped. Our children were kidnapped. This happened millions of times before to millions of Jews across history. Jew hatred exists because evil exists, because there are people who have, for literally all of human history, hated the Jews and sought to strike at them while they are weak, who have blamed the Jews for their own problems, who have crafted complex conspiracy theories about the supposed power of the Jews, who have sought to destroy, to murder, to mutilate, to rape the Jews. From Pharaoh to Haman, from Hitler to Hamas, the chain of Jew hatred is unbroken. For 2 millennia, since the destruction of the last Jewish dynasty in the Holy Land of Israel, those Jew haters were ascendant. Well, no longer. That is the promise of the state of Israel. Never again. The Jews will not stand by. They will not be murdered. They will not leave their biblical homeland. They will not surrender. They will be strong and courageous, chazak ve'amatz, as Joshua said 3,000 years ago. Israel is indispensable. This weekend proved it is indispensable. Its presence is a miracle. Its strength a gift. Thank God for the state of Israel. There are people who say that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. Tell that to the dead women and children in Sderot. Tell that to Hamas, who proclaim in their charter, quote, Israel will exist and will continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it, just as it obliterated others before it.
I don't think it's very wise to construct our politics around some grand narrative vision, inevitably quite simple and sprawling, but if this is the paradigm Ben sets up, it should be answered according to his method. I don't like this approach to politics because, in my experience, I find narrative visions tend to gloss over inconvenient details in order to organize a chaotic reality. They are often creative sentimentality supported by select details post hoc rather than abstractions based on comprehensive expertise. I think this is the case here with Ben's paradigm of Jewish identity in the West, and we can see this from the contradictory and inaccurate characterizations of Western Jewry in order to fit his narrative vision. And since he brought it up, we have no other choice than to examine this vision.
Because I'm a Jew, and because I'm an American. Americans love justice. Americans love the good. Americans resonate to the book of Psalms that says, hate evil, those who love the Lord. Hate evil, and fight it. Americans always have and they always will. I know we will. I'm a Jew. Those aren't just the words of martyrs. They're the words of heroes. They're the words of Moses in front of Pharaoh, and Jonah on the boat, and Esther in front of Ahasuerus. They're the words of the Maccabees. I am a Jew. Let me tell you what those words mean. They mean I'm a child of the people of the book, the people who brought the world Moses' message of freedom, and Jeremiah's message of justice, and Isaiah's message of hope. The people who represent the root of the values of the West, the people who preserve the tradition thousands of years old stretching back to Sinai, the people of the Ten Commandments and the splitting of the Red Sea, of the Holy Temple, and of Abraham's one God. I'm a Jew.
Really, truly a strange claim to be at one and the same time the ultimate victim of and the ultimate basis for Western civilization. This sense of some mystical, transcendent victimhood is, in truth, an oversimplification. The feeling of contempt between Christian civilization and the Jewish subculture within them was historically very mutual, based on deep divides over essential notions about the world. Each belief system is, at its most basic, a blasphemy of the values of the other. It's only natural, it's not surprising that they wouldn't get along. As Christianity was growing in strength during the late antique period, they wrote quite frankly of this notion. Origen, in Contra Celsum, said, "We say with confidence that they, the Jews, will never be restored to their former condition, for they committed a crime of the most unhallowed kind in conspiring against the Savior." Cyprian of Carthage, in his bluntly titled 3 Books of Testimonies Against the Jews, said, "The Jews, according to what had been foretold, had departed from God and had lost God's favor, which had been given to them in the past times and had been promised to them for the future." And finally, Ambrose of Milan stated, "The Jews are the most worthless of all men. They are lecherous, greedy, rapacious. They are perfidious murderers of Christ. The Jews are the odious assassins of Christ, and for killing God there is no expiation possible, no indulgence or pardon." If you want to find anger against Jews in Western or Christian history, you will certainly find it. But nor was this notion simply one-sided. It was reflected back with equal vigor in the Jewish view of Christianity we witness in the Talmud. Sanhedrin 106a says, "Papa observed, 'This is what men say. She who was the descendant of princes and governors played the harlot with carpenters.'" Gittin 57a said, "He went and raised Jesus by incantations. He asked him, 'Who is important in that world?' He replied, 'Israel.' What about joining them? He said, 'Seek their welfare, seek not their harm. Whoever touches them touches the apple of his eye.' He said, 'What is your punishment?' He replied, 'With boiling excrement.'" And from Sanhedrin 57a, "With respect to robbery, if one stole or seized a beautiful woman, or committed similar offenses, if these were perpetrated by one Kuthian against another, the theft, etc., must not be kept, and likewise the theft of an Israelite by a Kuthian, but that of a Kuthian by an Israelite may be retained." Describing Mary as a harlot and depicting Jesus in hell and carving out special privileges for your ethnic group within your laws is hardly a recipe for smooth relations with Christians or wider society, and this uneasy dynamic for the larger part of European history led to an oftentimes strained and contentious relationship, sometimes better, sometimes worse, but it should always be remembered, not based on an irrational hatred for Jews so much as from the mutual cultural contempt downstream of deeply opposed, even opposite religious beliefs. Even now, in our more pluralistic society, Ben Shapiro himself sort of awkwardly manifests this divide from time to time.
Jewish point of view, where we don't believe in the divinity of Christ. I think that there you can make an argument that the Gospels, which were written...
He was just a prophet. Right?
No. We don't even believe he was a prophet.
What do you think he was? What do you guys think he was?
What do I think he was historically? I think he was a Jew who tried to lead a revolt against the Romans and got killed for his trouble, just like a lot of other Jews at that time who were crucified for trying to lead revolts against the Roman and got killed for their trouble.
So he became legend in story, and it became a bigger and bigger deal as time went on.
Yeah, he had a group of followers, and then that gradually grew, and then
do you think he was resurrected?
No, that's not a... Jewish belief.
Okay, I just want to check.
Yeah, no, we're not into
You're not
we're not
into
into miracle
zombies?
stories. No, that's
No?
no.
You don't have any miracles?
No, not by Jesus. Right?
No?
They're ones in the Old
God
Testament.
ones?
Yeah, you've got Moses splitting the sea and all that.
This same divide, which naturally led the Jewish diaspora to develop culturally and religiously as more or less set apart from the European Christian societies in which they lived. But this was not because the Christians were just meanies. The Jews would no more mix with the Goyim than the Christians would with them. For this reason, up until fairly recently, Jews were not really part of what is broadly considered the Western canon, which is fine or not fine or whatever you want it to be, but it simply is, which is what makes Ben's claim to be also somehow the basis of said canon so strange. I understand that for many, the term Judeo-Christian is largely in reference to the fact that the Old Testament is a large part of the Western cultural inheritance, but its impact on the West is largely, in fact, exclusively through the lens of Christianity. The same Christianity which, among other things, evangelized non-Jews and developed itself as, very early on, very distinct from the Judaism as an ethno-religious vision continued by post-Christian Talmudic Judaism of the sort Ben practices. Here's what John Chrysostom, commenting on the Jewish scholar turned Christian evangelist St. Paul, had to say about this distinction in his homilies on Galatians. Speaking of the Jewish law, still observed by modern Jews, he said, "Surely Paul's object everywhere is to annul this law, and, so far as may be, to withdraw people from its yoke, and to lead them to Christ. And therefore you may see that in all his epistles, when he has begun to speak about the law, he brings his argument to a conclusion in no common way, but as one who is belligerent and earnest, for he uses every exertion to annul the law. Nevertheless, he makes use of it for the Jews' sake, who were vehemently attached to it." After this parting of the ways, Jews really went their own way culturally, not making any significant cultural contributions until the Enlightenment. So historically, I have a hard time seeing where this claim of attachment to the Western tradition is coming from. The turn of phrase Judeo-Christian is at best an oversimplification and unnecessary, as equally concise, more precise alternatives exist, such as Christian or Western. Even taking one of Ben's examples, the exodus of Israelites from Egypt, where the modern Talmudic Jews see an inspiring story of the resilience of their ethnos, a Christian sees a morally significant turn of God's people away from idolatry in the spiritual Egypt as more significant. The feeling was, in the words of Ignatius of Antioch, that it is absurd to speak of Jesus Christ with the tongue, and to cherish in the mind a Judaism which has now come to an end. The implication of this difference in vision is, in my view, largely up to the importance the individual chooses to place in it. For me, it is not very much. As mentioned earlier, I don't think grand visions, even ones which are fairly close to the truth, will ever be enough to fully encompass the whole story. Ben wants to stand by this principle, this vision. Others meet him in that ethereal level with their counterclaims, and a deep clash of civilizational visions must, in their view, occur. For my part, I say, c'est la vie. I don't attach as much significance to this tension or contribution as Ben does. Yes, there are civilizational rifts and conflicts, but they are only as sharp as we choose to act based upon them. I think the specifics, the policies, the actions, the circumstances ought to occupy more focus. Contradictions are part of life. Reality is messy and chaotic, and clear answers are scarce. Resting in ambiguity is often the most fair response to such contradictions, lest we justify injustice in action. There is no reason this contradiction has to be resolved unless it represents some clear and pressing threat of injustice, which I don't think it does at this time in America. And although we can't control how other people think, we can treat them with fairness and kindness in our real lives as individuals they are, shaped just like us, largely by factors outside of their individual control. We're all just trying to make it out here. I only wish Ben thought the same. In that more concrete world of actual action and policy, there is a subtext to this victimhood narrative that we Americans owe something to the Jews in justice for past wrongdoings we have inherited, or perhaps in a sense of kinship because they are part of the West, or even in a sense of duty to them to repay them for their beneficence to us. Ben isn't just proclaiming this now for no reason. There's an ask here. The grand narrative vision does eventually manifest in a concrete policy position.
Judaism, that has stood by our ancestors and by us, for not only one enemy has risen up against us to destroy us, but in every generation they rise up to destroy us. But the Holy One, blessed be he, delivers us from their hands. There are those who say that the Israeli-Arab conflict is a cycle of violence. Only the morally blind and obtuse could ever say such a thing. For decades, we've been told that if you look evil in its face, that was somehow unsophisticated. That to pretend evil away was an act of intellectual virtue. That to cater to evil, to concede to evil, was the pathway toward a better, more peaceful world. It was a damned lie. There are those out there who are proclaiming the complexity of it all. Those people are fools. They are fools, and what is worse, they are enablers of evil. They are fellow travelers. They are justifiers of the worst human rights violators on the planet.
The ask is that you stand with the good side, Israel, and condemn the bad side, Palestine. The simplest refutation of this came, surprisingly enough, from one of his own hosts, Candace Owens, of all people.
You know, something I really miss about my grandparents and something that I really appreciate about older people is that they have the wisdom to pause and reflect and to think. They're such great listeners. Do you know what I'm talking about? It seems that with age, you lose your impulse, and what comes with that and what is replaced with that is this ability to actually pause and hear other people in their entirety. Like my grandfather, whenever I would share something with him and I'd be ranting and raving about something going on in the family, he would sort of take it all in. My grandmother would do the same thing. And even the sounds they would make, it was as if they were eating something, you know, and you really feel like you're being listened to. Why am I bringing that up? Because so much of that has been removed in the world, and not just because of our youth, but also because of the technologies that we have created. Social media, of course, it's all about impulse. You want to be the first to publish. You want to be the first to retweet. You want to be the first to have a take on something, the first to issue a sweeping statement on something, no matter how complex the issue is. Social media is always about being first. And over the weekend, I would say probably midday Saturday, when I learned of the atrocities that were taking place in Israel, I would say that the experience that I had on social media was a lot like this meme. It reads, "I'm done being an expert in Ukraine war. I'm now an expert in Israel and Palestine's war." Yeah, that's kind of how it felt. Everybody was racing to make a statement. And I want to be clear that even if you remove this particular scenario, you could replace it with many others that have occurred over the past, right? You know, the Me Too movement, 5 seconds to issue a statement and say that you agree with this movement. You don't really know what it means, but you better say something right now or else you want all women to be subjugated and raped in America. Black Lives Matter. Who could forget the litmus test, the black square test? Well, George Floyd died. You have 45 seconds to post a black square. We will assume that this means that you are a racist and that you support atrocities towards black people. You have no time to even understand the issue, but you do feel this sort of peer pressure to say something or to do something, not to sit back, not to listen, not to even try to understand what you're talking about, what the implications are geopolitically, why you're hearing from people that are not experts in the region. And why is it that so many of the voices seem to be conflicting?
And look, I don't blame Ben for his passion. I think it's good for people to be proud of their heritage, and I think one of the inevitable byproducts of this is that they often will develop a bit of a blind spot around it. It's only human. But if we become enraptured in these sort of grandiose ethnic visions, these sweeping abstractions, we start to live in this abstract world, to construct our ethical decisions based upon them. And in our attachment to the integrity of this vision, the world becomes simple, black and white. The circumstances, which should comprise the majority of our consideration in this situation, give way to the strength of our conviction. It is the strength of their conviction upon which Hamas leans to justify their cruelty. Their evil is a byproduct of a mind which feels it is executing justice against the occupier in principle, despite the individual innocence of those they victimize. When it's all so black and white, though, anything goes. It's only natural for Ben to throw everything in the kitchen sink at this. He's got a lot of skin in the game, so to speak. And for the reasons I've stated, when it comes to the rape and murder of innocent lives, I'm with him 100%. The videos we've seen coming out of this conflict can only be described as evil. And for Ben, who already had a firm position on the matter, these videos serve to confirm what he already thought, that it is the Arabs who are evil in principle and the Israelis who are good. It is not necessary to follow him into this abstraction, and in fact, I think the results of this abstraction are inevitably in the identical justification of evil. It's how Ben justifies his own dehumanizing rhetoric against the Arabs right now. So despite Ben's passionate attempt to frame the issue as black and white, we have a moral obligation to resist him in this. The calls to flatten Gaza are already pouring in.
This is not just an attack on Israel. This is an attack on America, because they hate us just as much. And what we have to understand is this is the reason that we have to unite around making sure our enemies do not hurt our friends. America can never be so arrogant to think we don't need friends, just like we needed them on 9/11. That's why Ukraine needs us when Russia's doing this. That's why Israel needs us when Hamas and Iran are doing this. And I'll say this to Prime Minister Netanyahu: finish them. Finish them.
The final note, not that I think it would make much of a difference to Ben if he ever saw this response. I think I'm probably firmly in the camp of whatever he considers an anti-Semite to be. The reason I reject the notion of anti-Semitism is the same reason I reject Ben's sort of hyperbolic video here. Although I think it's natural for people to have pride in their heritage, I think this is sort of a human thing and healthy even, but also ultimately an unsatisfying approach to the world. Races and ethnicities, like everything else material, ultimately fade and die. So if your foundational values are based upon them, your priorities are probably somewhat askew. This is as true for Ben as it is for the white supremacist, Black Lives Matter activist or Arab he opposes. In his Dream of Shapiro, Cicero muses, even if those generations of men to come should care to hand down in succession from father to son the glory of each one of us, yet still, owing to the deluges and conflagrations of the earth, which must happen periodically, we cannot acquire a lasting, much less an eternal renown. It is good and wholesome to care about your ethnicity as an integral part of who you are. It is natural to love the noble parts of your heritage, but this aspect of your person is not ultimately enough to quench our thirst for eternal meaning in my view. And so I disagree with those who seek to do that from any ethnic perspective. And although Ben has appointed himself, it seems, as the ultimate arbiter and custodian of Jewishness and Jews, I know enough to look beyond his rather unfortunate insistence upon confirming the stereotype.
And I will comfort myself tonight by sleeping on my bed made of money.
I'm sure we have.
And that's the thing. Ben has, because of his strident and absolute tones, ironically made me see much better the points made by those who he purports to oppose. Luckily for us, reality is more complex than to be dictated to by the likes of him. There are many, many more normal, non-supremacist Jews, and they, through their ability to move through the world in an individual and non-ethno-ideological way, do far more for the Jewish race than he does. Normal Jews seeking to live their lives in peace and harmony with their friends and neighbors like we all do, not trying to play some game to get us to see the world according to this or that paradigm. These are the Jews who deserve the credit for doing what Ben, through his narrative ambition and lack of self-awareness, cannot. I don't view Jews like a monolith. Ben, on the other hand, does. Ben is actively trying to persuade us that they are. It's a weird thing for him to do, because if that were the case, and Israel was an essential component of Jewry, that Ben's vision of Jewish significance was the only Jewish view, then frankly, the anti-Semites might have much stronger of a case. He wants you to notice his ethnicity, and to think of it as a big, essential part of who he is and how he acts, but only in order to honor him for it. If somebody doesn't agree with his positions or attitudes, then I think Ben would demand they ignore his Jewishness or be labeled as an anti-Semite, or perhaps be just labeled as an anti-Semite for good measure. But if somebody hates Jews because they hate Ben Shapiro, they are taking Ben Shapiro at his word that he not only represents the authentic version of Jewry, but also that his Jewishness infuses his worldviews and actions, and his staunch support of Israel, historical vision of victimhood, claim to some great debt of gratitude from the West, and a generally strong ethnic preference for his own kind. I know he's wrong. It's not all Jews who have this sort of complex, but the white supremacists celebrate this screed from Ben because, more than any conjecture they could ever offer, it confirms their point of view from the horse's mouth. To put it in terms Ben might appreciate, imagine if the roles were reversed. Imagine if a German thought that his worth and sense of purpose were ordered primarily around his ethnicity. Of course, Ben has no more ability to fully define Jewishness than Hitler did of Germanness. Despite his efforts to portray himself as such, Ben does not have the authority to absolutely define Jewry. And I know this because
I am a Jew.